This is the new 2024 Honda Prologue, and it's a brand new electric crossover. It is not the fastest electric crossover, it is not the cheapest electric crossover, and it is certainly not the best electric crossover. It's something. It's fine. Today, I'm going to review the new Honda Prologue and show you what makes it only fine. And I'll also show you all of its quirks and features. Today's video is sponsored by Cars and Bids, which is my online car auction website for modern enthusiast cars. Cars and Bids has around 600,000 registered users, all excited to bid on and buy special cars like this and this and this and this. So, if you're looking to sell your enthusiast car, do it on Cars and Bids and reach a huge audience. All right, time for the quirks and features of the Honda Prologue, which, it should be stated, is Honda's first real EV, their first electric car. Honda had some sort of low-volume early attempts at electric cars going back to the late 90s, but this is the first one they're building in any real volume for the mass market. And interestingly, it was co-developed with General Motors, who sells a version as the Chevy Blazer EV, which I've already reviewed. The Prologue and the Blazer EV, they don't look that similar, but they share a lot of architecture, battery, technology, equipment, and materials. They're very similar vehicles underneath the exterior. And of course, the Chevy Blazer EV is also sort of just fine. Not great, but fine, as is this. So let me explain to start exactly why that is. The easiest explanation is on paper. The base model Honda Prologue starts around $49,000 with 212 horsepower, 0 to 60 in about 8 seconds, and a 296-mile range. By comparison, the base Tesla Model Y starts at $46,500. It's cheaper. It does 0 to 60 in 6.5 seconds. It's faster, and it has a 320-mile range. It has a longer range, so the Model Y has all of those benefits. Cheaper, faster, more range, and it gets worse for the Prologue as you go further into the lineup. This is the Prologue Elite, the top trim model with all-wheel drive and about 290 horsepower. This has a 280-mile range. It does 0 to 60 in about 6 seconds, and this one costs around $60,000. By comparison, the Tesla Model Y Performance also has a 280-mile range, but a starting price of $53,000, cheaper, and 0 to 60 in 3.5 seconds, which is like supercar fast. So with the same range, you pay less and you get better acceleration from Tesla. So, as you might imagine, I asked Honda what's going on. On paper, the Model Y just walks away from the Prologue in all the categories that people care about. And what they basically told me was that Honda is developing its own electric cars that are going to be tremendously competitive with the Model Y in a couple of years. But for now, they're watching Honda buyers every month, every year, leave the Honda brand for Tesla or other brands that offer electric cars. And so they wanted to get something to the market in the meantime that would slow down the outflow of Honda buyers. So this isn't the most competitive vehicle, and they kind of acknowledge that, but their point is, if you're a Honda loyalist who loves the Honda brand, maybe you don't want to buy a Tesla for a myriad of reasons, including crazy Elon Musk, then this is an option. Even though it's not the best electric vehicle, it's still relatively okay, and it gives Honda an electric vehicle competitor, so maybe they won't keep losing buyers to other brands since they now offer an EV. Interestingly, Honda has tried this strategy strategy before, and it has worked. In the 1990s, when SUVs were blowing up, Honda borrowed the Isuzu Rodeo and made a Honda version called the Passport that really wasn't all that competitive. The Passport was sold for a few years until Honda developed its own SUV, the Pilot, which was a huge, massive success from the day it first came out. And those extra years of development time gave Honda both an SUV in the meantime and some extra time to develop the SUV they needed. So that's the strategy here. And that's probably also why they call it the Prologue, because it's the prologue to Honda's own, maybe more competitive, better electric vehicle. So let's talk exterior quirks. Now, a big one is the overall styling, and I say that's a quirk because even though this is based on the Chevy Blazer and shares the architecture, the powertrain, it doesn't really look like the Blazer EV. Instead, it looks like, well, a Honda. You can see this fitting in with the family of the CR-V, the HR-V, and the Pilot. It has a lot of Honda styling cues, and looking at it from the outside, I'm not sure you would instantly recognize that it's based on the Chevy Blazer EV. They actually did a good job of Honda-fying the exterior of this car and really giving it sort of a Honda family look. Probably the most unusual exterior quirk is the rear badge, which spells Honda out across instead of using the typical famous Honda H logo in the center. This Honda badge is definitely a different thing, but I think that's the point of an electric vehicle. It's supposed to be futuristic and cool and different, and so that's why they've spelled it out on the back. Other than that, one could argue the styling is almost even a little generic. Aside from this sort of bluish greenish color, it kind of looks a little dull, and frankly, I think that's what they were going for. They didn't want to rock the boat too much. A brand new propulsion technology already does that, so come out with a design that's sort of familiar to consumers, people who may be coming out of a CR-V and want another Honda. They don't want something radical, so they get the Prologue with sort of a similar, familiar theme to other Honda models. And if that was their goal, to me, it seems like they've succeeded. Now, since we're outside, let's move up front under the hood where, interestingly enough, you don't have any storage up here. You pop this open, you can see it's all mechanical components. It strikes me that they maybe could have put some storage in the very center. You can see there's a bit of a hole there, but it certainly wouldn't have been very big. So if you're looking for a front trunk, unfortunately, you don't get it in the Prologue. Now, with that said, the cargo area in back is surprisingly large. You pop it open, you got good storage space back here, larger than you'd expect for a crossover of this size, wide, deep, flat, and you can lift up the load floor and there's even more storage underneath. In fact, a pretty good amount of extra storage for even more items if you don't want them rolling around in the cargo area. Now, most people love the concept of a front trunk, but when I talk to automakers and they do focus groups, they find that most buyers don't actually use front trunks. Most people would probably have more rear cargo space, and in that case, the Prologue delivers well. Worth pointing out, though, even though it's a power tailgate, there's no button on the power tailgate to both close and lock the tailgate at once, which is kind of annoying. So if you want to walk away from the car after getting stuff out, you gotta press the power tailgate, wait for it to close, and then lock it, which is a minor inconvenience, but still kind of annoying since most other automakers offer that lock and close button. But while the Prologue is certainly interesting, co-developed with General Motors, Honda's first real EV, probably the most interesting aspect is the interior, largely because this isn't really a Honda on the inside, and that's pretty clear. The General Motors-ness really makes itself known in the interior, and practically none of the controls in here will be familiar to people who have other Honda models and they're getting into a Prologue. For example, the shifter is on the steering column. You push down for drive, up for reverse, instead of the Honda shifters, which are in the center and they're kind of buttons and switches. More confusing for Honda people, the windshield wipers are not on that side of the steering column. Instead, they're integrated into the turn signal stalk, somewhat confusingly on these little dials in the center of the stalk. You kind of have to figure out which is front front and rear, and it's a little bit difficult to operate, at least when you're learning the controls. Another interesting General Motors control position is the amount of stuff that's integrated into the center screen. For instance, the power window lockout is not next to the power windows on the driver's door panel, but instead integrated into the screen. You want to turn on the dome light? You don't just tap on the light, you go into the screen. Even the headlights are not a switch to the left of the steering column or at the end of the turn signal stalk like on some Honda models. Instead, they're in the screen like on newer General Motors models. Now, I bring this up because Honda's goal for the Prologue is to mainly sell them to existing Honda buyers so they don't leave and flee to other brands. But I suspect this interior might be a little confusing to some Honda loyalists who have spent time in Pilots or CR-Vs or Odysseys. Now they want to go electric and they find themselves in a bit of a different interior that isn't necessarily what they're expecting from other Honda models. And that's because, well, it's not a Honda interior. It's all General Motors Chevrolet in here. Now, with that said, there are some nice benefits of this interior. One is this little key card. You can see it has the Honda logo on it. Flip it over and it shows where you place it on the outside in order to unlock the door. You don't need to use a standard regular key. Instead, you can use the key card you just keep in your wallet, which is a nice futuristic touch. And by the way, the standard regular key is indeed a General Motors key, as you can see, with the Honda logo just sort of grafted on into this circle where the Chevy or GMC or probably Buick logo would be instead of your typical Honda key. A lot of General Motors when you really look closely at this vehicle. Some other good stuff in this interior. Another one, the wireless cell phone charger is perfectly placed. You can see it's upright and sort of tilted, so you can still see the top of your phone, see if someone texts you, whatever, and it's right within reach of hand. And you won't leave it in some obscurely placed charger when you get out, park the car, and go somewhere. It's nice to see it there. You also have some extra storage under the center console. Some center console storage and then more below, which is a nice little addition for practicality that I like to see. Now, with that said, there are some rather unusual controls in here as well. One thing I find hilarious is the sport button. This car does have a sport mode, but you wouldn't know it if you got inside and looked around unless you look closely. To the left of the steering wheel, sort of hidden below the climate vent, there's a small button marked Sport. And if you press that, it turns on sport mode, which is indicated in the gauge cluster with this speedometer over a road like a setting sun. That is apparently sport mode, clearly an afterthought in this car. Also rather unusual is the climate controls. Right now they're off, and you can turn on the climate controls by pushing the increase fan speed button. That makes sense. You add fan speed, it turns them on. But the drawback is you can't turn them off by pushing the decrease fan speed button. You can decrease all you want, but it'll still stay on unless you press a separate on-off button, which is kind of a confusing step. And then there's this button marked heat. What is that? I can change the climate control temperature and add heat by adjusting these dials. Why is there a separate button for heat? So you can turn the dials to the coldest possible temperature, but then also turn on the heat button, which doesn't make any logical sense, but that's what's going on in here. Now, with that said, and some weird quirks, the Prologue does have one nice potential benefit over the Blazer EV, which is that it offers Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. General Motors and Chevrolet have gone away from Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. They've developed their own system, which frankly works pretty well. But Apple CarPlay is very familiar to a lot of people, and the Honda Prologue offers it, even though this car uses a General Motors infotainment system. It's kind of weird to see CarPlay return to a GM system, but it's there. And the really cool thing is that it still uses Google for Assistant and Maps. All new General Motors vehicles have Google Maps and Google Assistant integrated, and since this has a General Motors infotainment system, it also has those functions. So you have the best of all worlds. Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, which you can't get in General Motors, but Google Maps and Google Assistant, which you do get in Chevy and General Motors. It's actually kind of a nice mashup of technology in this car. And the gauge cluster screen has a full Google Maps screen if you want it. It's not really showing here because I'm down in an underground bunker and there's no real reception or service, but this is a Google Maps screen, just like you'd have in your Google Maps app on your phone, which is actually pretty useful and helpful to have that integrated into an in-car infotainment system without going into an app. All the cars with Apple CarPlay, you can really only see your Google Maps screen in your center infotainment screen, but here you have it in your gauge cluster as well, which is nice to see. And speaking of screens and tech, it's worth pointing out that the overall screen, the center infotainment, is actually pretty impressive, just like in newer GM vehicles. They've simplified, they've made it very responsive, very intuitive, very well laid out and easy to use, and I think that this screen technology is pretty good, which is actually a benefit over newer Honda models. Hondas have kind of confusing infotainment systems with smaller screens, sometimes dual screens. It can be a little bit difficult to figure out. GM has a better infotainment system than Honda, so this partnership has given the Prologue better technology than almost all of its Honda compatriots at the dealer. Now, with that said, despite what I consider some great benefits of technology in this car, the interior is not really so great. Like I said, $60,000 sticker price for this Prologue, just under, like $59,500, and I don't really see a $60,000 interior here. It's fine, it's nice enough, but it doesn't look that nice for the price point. There's just a little too much cheap plastic, not enough stitching and leather. It just doesn't feel like a $60,000 experience, which is kind of a common General Motors trait, not really delivering the interior quality for the price point. Unfortunately, that trickles into this Honda as well because of the General Motors development. Just not that nice of an interior for the money. As for the back seat in the Prologue, I gotta say, it's pretty nice back here, especially in terms of interior space and rear seat room. Headroom is a bit tight for the very tallest people. When I'm 6'4", I sit upright, my head just kind of touches against the headliner, probably because the panoramic sunroof sort of lowers things a little to get all the mechanisms in there, so it's a little tight there, but leg room and knee room is actually fantastic for a small to mid-sized crossover. Same deal with hip room. It really is a surprisingly spacious rear seat back here, and because it's an electric vehicle, there's no hump in the floor for the middle passenger. So you really do have a legitimate space to put someone in the middle seat and have a true 5-seater, which isn't always the case with some crossovers where you don't really have enough space for a middle passenger to be comfortable. Now, with that said, some other nice benefits back here. You have your climate vents, as you can see. That's a nice touch at this price point in this segment. Not every vehicle has rear climate vents, but this one does. You also have 2 USB-C ports for charging devices and a household-style power port, which is fantastic. A true power plug that you can plug stuff in. Instead of a cigarette lighter style plug, this is fantastic. It really delivers, and it lets you plug in whatever you want, including a blender or a toaster in the back of your Prologue. Maybe. You also have cup holders back here. You put down the center armrest and you have 2 cup holders in the middle. That's not my favorite way to do rear seat cup holders because it means if you have someone seated in the center, you don't have a place to put cups. And indeed, there's not really cup holder storage on the door panels like in some cars, but still, you got them back here. It's better than nothing, and the rear seat in the Prologue is a pretty good place to be, all things considered, particularly for the price point and vehicle size. All right, driving the Honda Prologue. You know, it's not often, I was thinking about this, it's not often that I'm in a Honda that is not one of the segment leaders. You know, Honda is just such a careful automaker and a conservative automaker, but also an automaker that is focused heavily on refinement and improvement and perfecting. And so like the Accord is not like an incredibly exciting or amazing car, but it has been refined and improved. It's almost like the Porsche 911 of midsize sedans. It's just been refined and improved so much over so many years that it's just in this fantastic car that perfectly knows the market. Same deal with the Pilot, same deal with the CR-V and the HR-V, same deal with the Civic and the Odyssey. And those are kind of Honda's core 6. And they're all segment leaders. Every one of those cars is one of the very best cars in its segment. And then you get into this, and it's like, huh. This isn't that. This just straight up is a average, sort of partially competitive car that just is not a segment leader. And I've given you all the reasons for that already. So let's talk about the driving experience. Once again, it's not really class leading. And I think one great example of that is the acceleration and the performance of this car. Honda spins it as, well, we don't necessarily want to have too much acceleration because our buyers are not used to it, and we don't want to startle them. And it's like, well, okay, but but that's one of the big selling points of a lot of EV rivals is their acceleration. And meanwhile, this car accelerates like a regular vehicle. A 0 to 60 supposedly on this version is somewhere around 6 seconds. To be perfectly honest, it doesn't feel that fast. It may be that fast, it doesn't really feel that fast. And it's in part because other electric cars I'm used to, when I'm in an electric car and I put my foot down, just this wall of acceleration, and this just doesn't have it. 6 seconds 0 to 60 is not so bad. However, this is not the base model. The base version, which has 75 less horsepower, is probably doing 0 to 60 in like 8.5, and that is just a total miss when it comes to EV and performance that people are expecting from electric vehicles. So from an acceleration standpoint, it accelerates like a normal car, even though, you know, you're paying more and you're expecting something different considering that it's an electric car. The quality of the ride and the driving experience is otherwise fairly traditional, which is to say, like, not all that engaging or exciting. And I think that's a little bit of a miss there too, because in my opinion, I think some of the reason that people want to switch into electric cars, at this stage, they're still pretty early adopters. They want something that's exciting. They want something that's different or cool. And this really just does not deliver that. It just delivers a fairly traditional vehicle experience, just happens to be in an electric car. It's also a relatively comfortable ride. It's a relatively easy and fairly simple and kind of conservative car. There's certainly nothing too negative or too bad about it, I would say. And that's an important point to keep in mind, because although this is a mediocre car, although it's a middle of the pack, you know, not tremendously competitive with the best, it certainly is fine. And I think that the buyers of this car really will be people who are used to a CR-V, a Pilot, etc., want to get into an electric car, and they're a little bit worried about switching brands, or they're a little bit worried about leaving the Honda experience. They're a little bit worried about going to Tesla, which has some craziness to it. Like, you hear some stories about difficulty in repairs and delays, and not a lot of people are not particularly keen on buying a car from Elon Musk at this point. So in that situation, you end up with some buyers, particularly when you see the kind of incentives that Honda is already putting on this car in order to get people to buy it. So a regular brand loyalist who's maybe looking for a deal on a lease payment, that's the buyer for this car. But it certainly won't be someone who's looking for the best electric car. This isn't that, this will not be that. But it is a conservative choice that will get you where you need to go and do what it's supposed to, just not better than some of its rival EVs like EV6, Ioniq 5, Mach-E, and of course, kind of the gold standard still, the Tesla Model Y. This isn't quite on that level. It's good, it's fine, it's acceptable, but it is not great. And you know what? That's okay. A lot of car companies produce cars that are not great. It's just unusual to see it from Honda. So we wait for Honda's own electric vehicles to hopefully retake a position of, you know, greatness that we're used to from Honda. And so that's the new 2024 Honda Prologue. People will buy or lease this because they don't want to be associated with Elon Musk and Tesla, or because they know Honda and they're a loyalist to the brand, or because they're already offering massive incentives. They certainly won't buy it because it's the best. Instead, it's merely fine. And now it's time to give the new Honda Prologue a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 51 out of 100, which puts the Prologue here against rivals. Not exactly in a great spot. It's fine tying its mechanical twin, the Chevy Blazer, and beating out the mediocre Volkswagen ID4, but the best cars in this game are clearly the Hyundai Ioniq 5, Ford Mustang Mach-E, and the Tesla Model Y. And the Prologue doesn't really offer any compelling reasons to pick it over those cars unless you're extremely attached to the Honda brand, or you get a really good deal.